I don't like.
Ooh. Okay, everyone. So today we have Gabrielle Rios. She is an instructor at Pratt University and does a lot of character / animation work / maybe we'll get into a kind of interactive design character work. How would you sort of label yourself as an artist or an animator or whatever title you want to use?
Oh, that's a great question. I tend towards calling myself an illustrator, an animator, and a memer. Like I tend to do a lot of joke work just because it inspires me to like continue doing my own work before I go, to Pratt or I go to instruct any class of students. So yeah, it's mostly animation, it's mostly illustration. And then some of it is like 3D. That's tends to be where I found myself in because it required the most instruction. So I learned a lot of 3D. Now I'm a 3D animator. Cool. Before that, I was an illustrator and a graphic designer. But yeah.
So this might be a little bit different for you. So normally when I sort of start with like, where does your love of animation? But it seems like there's kind of a different, you're sort of spreading yourself off into different areas. Where does your love of art or interactivity start?
Yeah, let's see. So it's actually a really specific point in my life. When I was younger, I played this game called Final Fantasy VII, and I fell in love with it. And then later, a movie came out based on the game, which was called Advent Children, Final Fantasy Advent Children. And it was a 3D animated movie. And it was probably the first
from the early 2000s.
Yeah, with like the long wavy hair.
I never saw it, but I remember hearing about it was like the first film that was motion captured. Was that true, or did I just make that up?
It does. It's one of the first films that like used so much motion capture, probably.
Right.
Like I'm not sure about the specifics. I do remember that Spirits Within was a movie before it that it was also pretty big, and it is the inspiration for like the Iron Man setup, where in the movies of Iron Man, he has like a facial display and he'll like move things around like to talk to Jarvis.
Right.
That happened in Spirits Within for like the very first time, and that was After Effects animation. So I was like, oh man, I love this. I want to do this. So I went into like After Effects animation for a bit to be like a motion designer. And then I saw like Advent Children and I lost my mind. I decided that right then and there, I wanted to make like video game characters that like jump around on the screen and like fight each other because it's super cool.
From like an animation standpoint or from a video game or something in between?
I really wanted to go into video games specifically. And as I got older, I realized that most of the indie studios that were by me were mostly still doing 2D or like 2D art, whether it's sprite work or like side scrolling animation, like stuff like that. And yeah, no, I was like, no, I want to make 3D characters. I want them to be cool. And I want them to jump around. I want them to have hair. So I kind of just went to school for that. So where I ended up going to school was FIT, or the Fashion Institute of Technology, and it was a good bang for my buck. I learned about interactive design, which is what we like to call video game design, I guess now, at that school, and 3D animation. And it was honestly probably one of the best decisions of my life. Yeah, because I still really enjoy it, and it's a versatile skill set. Like there's people who want to do it for animation, there's people who want to do it for advertisement. I have a friend that's in medical animation where it comes to like creating and like rendering out like medical, I guess, displays.
What's funny is you say that one of my very first like job was kind of like one of the first paying gigs I ever had. This is like early 2000s, mid 2000s. Was I used to do Maya. And this was a time when like a lot of people didn't do that. And so I went to Carnegie Mellon, so I was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And Pittsburgh has a very deep medical, like University of Pittsburgh is actually very well known for their medical. And so my first gig ever getting paid for any sort of artwork was I was making 3D models for medical. And I had this like doctor, and I would like make, because he had to like do presentations and all this kind of stuff to get more funding. So I was like, I was modeling and like doing After Effects to like give him like videos for his presentation. It's kind of funny that you talked about that because it's
great. I have to say, like if you're if you are getting into, because at this point it's to the class, if you guys are interested in like getting in like 3D animation, that is definitely an aspect that's still very prevalent and like necessary. There are of course like like anatomical models available online, but being able to actually just put them into an animation is that's a trust me, doctors are great when it comes to like trying to keep you healthy, but they're terrible at like explaining like how it works. So even something as simple as like a Tylenol commercial comes to just like, here's the head and here's the color.
Right.
I have a headache. That's to visually represent somebody's ideas. Pretty refreshing. I personally didn't enjoy it when I was working on like there was a PSA I had to do for the health coalition. There's like a New York Health Coalition to end racism and discrimination in the healthcare industry. Super long, super great. It was hard talking to 3 different people that all had different ideas of how they should represent any of the conflicts the characters were facing.
Right.
Yeah, but we did settle on like a character that's trying to help their community while leaving work, even though they are a doctor, and not having the time like to themselves. Like they needed more funding just because they're trying to tell their neighbor wear a mask, or trying to tell their other neighbor some prenatal vitamins because she's pregnant, like stuff like that. Like just being accessible to the community was what we wanted them to know that doctors in the space were feeling. They felt overwhelmed. So yeah, that was an interesting project, mostly because of how much I talk a lot more in my job than I'd expected. I thought it would be mostly animation, but I started getting more team lead positions, and it's like I talk a lot to people trying to figure out what they want.
Yeah. Well, I always kind of joke that like half of my job is waiting for someone to approve something so that I can move forward. Not so much in animation, but I do a lot of web work. So it's like sending a mock-up and getting it approved so that like you can start going to the next step. Because until they approve it, you can't do anything.
It's kind of interesting how like a client kind of works on a different timeline than us, because I'll get something and they'll expect me to make a change, or they'll expect our team to make a change within the day. And I'm like, that's not gonna happen. Like someone's on another project or I'm on another project. It's not possible. But then
some with clients, sometimes you have to like, especially this is usually with lower level, like in terms of payment, expectations of what is realistic. Like I remember there was a period of time I was doing 3D contract work. This was like slightly late 2000s. And I had this guy who was like, I want you to model a realistic bird, like, like photorealistic, not just like cartoon. And I was like, okay, I can do that, but that's going to take time because it's like, that's a lot of like working with alpha channels at the time. I mean, nowadays it's probably a better way to do it, but this is like 2000.
Nowadays it's probably like MASH or something, like to generate.
So I was like, well, I can do that, but it's going to take a long time. Are you willing to pay for that? And of course he wasn't. So it's like, I was like, we can do it. I mean, anything's possible if you have enough money to throw at it, but it's like, is that what you can afford? Is that what you want? Like,
usually not. I have to say that the projects I've worked on where we as a team were told to work on something for people that had a budget, like a pretty large budget, but it was their own money. That's when it was like, okay, they kind of know what they want and they came in with a plan. Like it's really rare because I can only remember one project. I've been working at this place called Tapper, the animation project, for about 3 years or so. And in that span of time, I only had we've had one client that knew what they wanted. But in the event of every other situation, especially like with the Health Coalition, it was interesting just because they weren't paying for it. The city was paying for it. So they just kind of assumed that it was free work. And I'm like, no. It's still work that we have to do. You're just not going to have to like compensate us for it. The city's compensating it, but we don't have unlimited resources here. This is still a project that has limits, and that was always fun because they came up with like 6 different characters, and we'd already had like a discussion of, no, you have one main character. This can't be longer than a minute or 2 minutes at this point, because at that point it's not a PSA. Like you're trying to make a short film.
Right. Well, so I think we've gotten a little too in the weeds maybe for my students, but maybe we can kind of back it up a little bit. And so you seem like you are working, you do contract work, or you're working for a group that does contract work?
I currently work for a group that does contract work, which is the animation project. And then I do freelance. I guess I'm technically a visiting professor for Pratt because I've done 2 courses with them, probably working on a 3rd, honestly. They have a very nice campus. And I'm looking for more contract work because I've only I think I've like guest starred, we'd call it. I guest starred in someone else's projects, and I think I'd like to get more like steadier credits in
Sure,
indie
understood.
games and stuff. Yeah.
So can you walk my students maybe through, let's say you're working with the animation project, you're part of a group that's working on a project. Can you kind of, I mean, you don't have to go through every single,
Sure,
nuance of it, but like, what's the process like, just so they can understand what a professional process might look like?
sure thing. I would like to add the disclaimer that the process that we use at TAP has been adjusted for like a very small team.
Sure.
If you end up working at like an animation studio that has multiple animators, above 10 of them, you're going to have a different pipeline. But for the most part, in our team, we have a pipeline that responds to having about 5 animators on one project. And we have a director, which is supposedly the person that is going to set the expectations of our client, as well as give us the final go-ahead on what exactly we're going to do. And then we also have like our producer. So the producer is the person that is directly talking to our clients and telling them how long it's going to take. Even like they're supposed to be the one that's another animator, in fact, which was very refreshing. Another animator that has that authority to just tell them what we can and can't complete. And then the director is mostly on the side of our management, who aren't animators, but are more on the keeping clients happy side of things. And they discuss things with them. So from that, we end up making a production schedule or a shot list. Sure. Which is extremely fast, by the way. I wouldn't recommend jumping right into that. But we start making our production shot list of how long we think this is going to take. And then we run it into finally making storyboards. So a storyboard should usually come before you make a shot list. But we had to improvise because the 2 projects that happened in the previous summer, they just had too quick of a deadline. So we had to immediately jump into what we wanted to see before we could visualize what we had to see. So we put down our requirements. I was one of the storyboard artists as well as one of the other animators. Then we moved it into creating our models or hard assets. So things like the characters that were going to be in the scene, the props that were going to be available. And there was like one person that was responsible for set design. So kind of unusual, but it worked for us at the time. And so when we had our sets, when we had our models, which were going to be the props, and then we had our characters, each of those were kept in separate locations. We then had them rigged out. We had one rigging artist who then, of course, had to.
Let me stop you real quick, because
yeah, sure.
This is a 2D animation course, so
sure.
She's getting into some 3D things that we don't do, and don't worry. So when she says things like rigging, that's a 3-dimensional 3D animation thing that's specific to that genre.
Yeah.
Less like, I mean, not that you can't do it in 2D, but it's different and it's less common.
Yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean, just wanted to kind of clarify that for my students.
No problem. It's an important clarification, especially if they do want to get into anything more like commercial 2D. In commercial 2D, like you probably will get a rig. Like Toon Boom will be the base program for it most likely. If they even still use it, I'm out of the game. But in 3D, yeah, we have our characters and they can't just move on their own, man. It's the saddest thing. The day they figure out how to make those characters move by themselves, I am out of luck, because that's mostly what I do. And so we take.
I hear ChatGPT is working on that right now. So.
Oh boy. Yeah. We can have a side conversation about that and like how that's affecting my work, like at Pratt, like as an instructor. But yeah, in terms of this project, with TAP, we had our characters that were made. They were made in the 3D space, so they're basically a puppet. They're an empty puppet, like a balloon. So we have to move them around, but we need to give them some kind of framework. So that framework is the rig. Those are the bones that our character model is connected to. And then we move those around in order to make them, act and behave like a character in a scene instead of just a wavy balloon. So we have a rigging artist who's the person that specializes in creating these controllers for us to use as animators. And there was only one of them on our team because we have a very small team. So he, our rigging artist, had to enlist other people to help. And I was one of those lucky people that suffered as well. But it is a fun process. It's just extremely technical. It's one of those things where in art, you go all the way into art and then you come up the other side and it's STEM again. Now you're doing math. Which was fun.
Well, I always kind of joke, not so much in this animation course, but I teach a lot of web development. And I'm basically like, graphic design programs I actually say this about 3D. I think 3D programs at their heart are physics programs.
Yeah.
Like, they're physics programs that we use to make animations, but at the end of the day, they're still basically physics. Like,
yeah, it's
how
kind
light
of amazing.
bounces off of something, or like
yeah, because they all started off as like being something to tell you when a theoretical project would work, like being able to do construction or being able to do architecture. Like they're workhorse programs, and we kind of like finagled them into being artistic programs back with Toy Story. So it was crazy to see that, yeah, we just need to be able to make it work for us. So we can't see how these characters move, the computer can. We just make the rig so we can see it. So yeah, we made the rigs, we created these characters, and every single time, I tell you, every single time a character had a design change, had an update to their age, had an update to their hair, needed different clothing, needed different like jewelry. There was a long section of, I had about an hour meeting with the people of the PSA, explaining to them why I don't think adding like dynamic like earrings. They said like, oh, we wanted her to have hoop earrings that like move, and I'm like, okay, that's going to be either animating them or we're just going to like give them something that makes them react to gravity. And we didn't have time for that because this was in the tail end of actually like finishing the characters. So I was like, okay, how about we just do studs which don't move and we'll update the rigs like that. And that seemed to placate everyone. Boy, did I get talked to about that afterwards, where they're like, oh, well, we can't, we're supposed to tell them we can do it. I'm like, no, if you are unable to provide, make sure you undersell, and then you can try and give your audience something that they didn't expect now, because you told them you can't do it. Now we can do something a little bit close to what it is. So meeting them in the middle. But yes, we finished those rigs, updated them. I believe the rigs that we had listed, the characters themselves, were version 30 by the time we were done with the project, because of all the small changes, nitpicking that went around. But yeah, then we animated them. Each animator got a shot or a set of shots, and those are like a Maya scene. It's basically like you save the project and then you just give somebody else like, okay, you're doing frames 100.
By the way, Maya is a three-dimensional program that does, so Pixar actually has their own thing, but when you think of like Pixar, that's what Maya does essentially.
Yeah, so if you're using any program to like animate, it'll count it in frames. So we give each other a list of frames to deal with, and that'll be, hopefully, if your storyboard is correct, the end of a character action or the beginning of a new character action. And that's really just how it is. We're just trying to link our actions together, even if we're not in the same space. Because I was actually fully remote for this project, so that's another aspect that was interesting. If something went wrong, I couldn't really just turn to one of my coworkers and say, hey, what's going on? I actually got phone calls from coworkers too, where it's like, yo, Gabby, I need help on this. And I'm like, same, let's workshop it together. So we'd open up a Zoom together and we'd share each other's screen and we'd work. So in that way, working remotely didn't really take too much away, because then we had a more focused workshop between each other versus like in a wider room, and eventually we'd get lunch and we'd just leave. Like, that's how it works. But yes, so we finished out that project. It went from our ideation phase, where it's like, the storyboards, to talking to our clients, the adjusting the shot list, and anything that we needed. We updated them. We updated our shots. We updated our list of projects that we needed to get finished. And then we went into animating. Animating was the longest part. My gosh, was it long, especially when I think they changed one of the characters from standing to having a walk. And that's a lot to do. It's a lot more to change. Having a character move that was static for most of the time. And then we had to go into the rendering process. So everything was in Maya, this 3D program, and it looks a certain way. It looks a certain fake way when you see it inside of a 3D program. We had the idea of streamlining the render process. Terrible idea, by the way. Don't have ideas in the middle of production. By moving everything into the Unreal Engine, which I was familiar with because I'd worked on it for some projects, and then my coworker was familiar with because he was an actual like designer of another project, so he was more comfortable with Unreal, and then I was comfortable enough to help him. So we started working in Unreal to create a shader.
Hold on, pause real quick.
Yes.
Unreal is a game engine, which also can work with 3D models. So not quite an animation program in the traditional sense. I mean, I've used Unity. I've never really used Unreal, but so
it's similar.
It's
in
similar,
that,
I'm assuming. So it's like it has the ability to animate,
yes.
but it doesn't have all of the features I would guess that an animation program has.
Yes. The main aspect with the Unreal Engine, which if anyone has played Fortnite, it's made in Unreal Engine. If anyone's played the Final Fantasy VII Remake game, that is also made in Unreal Engine. It has a great variety of styles that it can like render out for you. Hyper realistic, toon. Those are the wide gamut. This program in particular, you can't really create the 3D assets in there. Like that's the main thing. You can't create your characters inside of Unreal. I mean, you could, but then you'd be animating a box. Like the 3D modeling portion of it isn't there most of the time.
It's more of a layout program than a creation.
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say it's for layout. It's for rendering, real-time rendering. It's actually pretty good for that. They use it on The Mandalorian so that they can like real-time render out sets while the characters are acting, which is also super cool because Maya takes forever to do anything. I love it, and I keep working in this program. Help me. So it was our best option to render as fast as we needed. The only issue, of course, is well, when you go into a game, you're looking through the eyes of a character. Like that's a camera that's character based. We needed to have a bunch of cameras that were all looking through the eyes of the audience. So it took a while, but we had to export out cameras, export out the full scenes, like the scene setups themselves, and then we had to like match the frames so we could just export them out like quickly. The only issue was with the shader, which was not good. So a shader is it's basically something that tells the computer what you're looking at is a certain texture, is a certain brightness, is a certain color. Like I would be textured in a standard surface because I'm not very shiny, but I have surface scattering because that's what skin's like. It's like, you're kind of squishy. Like it just shows you that. But if something's metal, it has a different shader on it. Like it's made out of something that's harder. It's more reflective.
It reacts different to light, that sort of stuff.
So that's what it is. We're basically hard coding the reactions to light into the program, which is very helpful because they have a lot of standard setups. But we did it, and for some reason, everything came out a lot like brighter than I had intended. And I asked them, I'm like, so what happened with the shader? And there may have been another light source, which is another fun thing about 3D. So if you work in 2D, you're fully creating your backgrounds and you're like painting them in and you're creating them yourself. In 3D, we have light. So light will literally react to surfaces and it'll brighten them or darken them as needed, as volume. So we have volumetric light. It'll show you if something's rounded. It'll show you something's standing in the way of a light source. The only issue is, if you have an extra light and you didn't see it, that doesn't mean the program didn't see it. So it just started making stuff up.
Right.
Which is a polite way of saying, we goofed. So anyway, to fix that, I proposed the final solution of making like After Effects our final render process. So that's a program that I use, and I just put everything in there and I adjusted the lights because After Effects is basically Photoshop for video.
Sure, yeah.
So that was the final process. It took me the better part of like a day to finish it out and have it sent so that we can have it reviewed in finality and totality. So we finished our project on time, which was very surprising.
So can you give us kind of like what was the soup to nuts start from talking with the clients, understanding what they wanted to finished, animation?
Yeah, that was about
the time period here.
So we were supposed to have it done, I believe, within 3 months.
Okay.
And that was an animation that was about a minute. So it was about a minute long. I believe it got shortened to 45 seconds with a second like accompaniment video. So we kind of got, they trapped us with that one. But it was about, so it was about a minute long of animation in full. It was 3 months of production. All of the beginning part of our production was the first week. So the first week was spent giving us ideation. And
so coming up with the story, coming up with the character, or
and it's very clear in the animation that we didn't have as much time to come up with the story. That was literally just that week. Everything else was constructing our assets. So that was probably about 2 more weeks of work because we work from Monday to Thursday and then alternating Fridays at this particular place during summer hours.
Okay.
So that went that went great. By great, I mean oof, because we also had our own individual work between it, where I would be groups in between animating, and then I think the final render process took us about a week. So it was supposed to be 3 months. We shortened it down to about 2 months of concentrated work, so about 8 weeks, and then we had an extra week. So 9 full weeks, I believe, of our actual process. Honestly, with the way that this is sounding, I assure you, I was not the producer. So I didn't actually make the schedule. I would probably be very so terrible to see this written out. I think I still have the project file for that actually. And then that final week was when we just spent rendering desperately and trying to figure out if there were any 2D assets that we can add to the scene. Yeah, because the 2D assets had to be added in separately in a process called compositing, for homies that don't know, which is where you kind of just add anything that's not natural to your project into the project, is the way I tended to think of it. So that's like stuff like fire, adding 2D assets to a 3D film, adding 3D assets to a live action film, compositing. And yeah, so the compositing process, we made there was a misunderstanding during one of the compositing processes, so we just decided to make a simplified version of a Zoom layout for it.
So I kind of want to go back to what you're saying here. And so with my students, everything we do in this class, it's an asynchronous class. So everything is individualized. So some of them don't have experience working on a project like this in a group. Or working. So I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. So what's it like for you to work in a group, and maybe what are some tips you might give people on how to work in a group effectively and things like
that? Number one is everything after you leave school is group work. Even in school, you should probably start with group work. Most of my projects are indeed like group work. It has to do with knowing that you can perform your task very well, but then someone else on your team might need assistance. So if you're on a smaller project, I do 2 or 3 different jobs, just because it's part of my expertise and I want to make sure that the project stays on target. If you're in a larger process, you'll have people that are more specialized. Okay, you have someone that only does hair, or only does fur, or only does, in our case, at our studio, only does rigging. That's their specialty and that becomes their niche. And it's something you just kind of do. I'm not going to lie to you. Your niche will sometimes be something that is your second favorite thing to do, because your favorite thing will normally be taken. So then you'll do your second favorite thing and that'll become your most proficient job, will become your second favorite thing.
Kind of funny. I have a friend who I forgot what studio he works at. He's up in Seattle. I want to say he did work at Microsoft and now is somewhere else, but he became, and I don't want to speak for him, but not that he doesn't like this, but he became just the go-to guy for environments for video games. It's just what he does. And I'm not saying he doesn't like it. I'm sure he does, but it's I don't know if that's his favorite thing to do, but it's he's very good at it, obviously. And, that's an important skill that needs to be done. So so it's we all can't necessarily do, if you're working in a team, you all can't do the most fun thing necessarily.
Exactly. Which is usually the model. Someone really wants to make the characters, or someone really wants to make the storyboard, or someone really wants to make the final render. There's too many people for the job. So you just get people who kind of love it, but maybe it's not their number one favorite thing. And that combination of proficiency and lack of attachment is important when you're in a team. That's why it's your second favorite thing that you become known for. It's the thing that you can do the fastest because you're not focused on perfecting it as hard as you would if you were someone that this is your number one thing to do. I spend way more time on character concepting than I should, when I should be focusing on finishing it. So that's why they moved me into animation, because I'll just move the character, because I'm I don't really think it needs to be as hard as it is to get these characters moving. So I'll do it. If with that lack of attachment, when you come to review, or you do your dailies, which is where every single day you have to review the work that you're doing, I'm very easily taking criticism. I'm not as attached to that piece of work. So I'm not going to think that someone's criticism is a criticism against me. It's a criticism against how this fits the goal. That's all it is. So having a tough skin is pretty important.
I do tell my students that a lot. Unfortunately, whether it's your own people you work with or whether it's the client will have no trouble telling you about something they dislike, or at least in my experience, they've never had problems with that. So I'm assuming other people have pretty much had the same experience. It's like you got to kind of just let it, like you said, not take it personal, let it roll off you like water off a duck, and be like, okay, you didn't like this, fine, what do you want, or how do we solve this problem?
I've also had the opposite happen, where we'll do something and the client won't be forthcoming. Like they just won't tell you that something isn't right, like, or they don't think it's good, basically, like, because they don't really have as many words to explain how they feel about a piece than someone who went to art school or somebody who went to design school. Like, it's not a matter of like an elitism thing. It really has to do with the vocabulary. Like, they don't know how to articulate what they're feeling about a project. And that became an issue with our healthcare project. They didn't know how to say they didn't like that a character was too thin, or that a character wasn't the height they wanted, because they thought it was going to be an attack against us personally. And I had to clarify to them, I'm like, look, do you want this character to be slim? Do you want this character to be heavy set? Like, just tell me. Like, I'm fine with it. This is not my baby. This is not my be all end all. It is my goal, and it is my important project, because I'm doing it for you, but I would like to have very clear and detached criticism. Some people get passionate.
Kind of leads to another question that I thought maybe you could talk about, since it sounds like this is something you have a lot of. And so some of the animators I have, they do their own work, so they're not really beholden to anybody, obviously when you work at Disney, or you're doing contract work where it's like, you have a very specific client who wants very specific things, you're dealing with someone and you're trying to appease them. And also it sounds like, at least with this healthcare thing, that you had a lot of revisions, right? A lot of like checking in and wanting revisions. And this is something that's not exactly unfamiliar in any sort of design work. But can you talk about what it's like to sort of work with a client and try to work with their expectations and what and their revisions that they want and things like that?
Yeah, sure thing. I think it's funny because I have two experiences with it. The number one experience being with the animation project in New York, which works through the mayor's office. So it's called like the Made in New York animation project, where we're sponsored by the mayor's office in order to provide like animation to either companies that are underneath I don't want to say companies, I guess I'll say groups that are underneath the umbrella of the mayor's office. So things like the healthcare organization, as well as like in schools. So a lot of DOE stuff, we'll go and we'll do actual school groups, and we'll talk to kids, and then we'll provide the animation sources kind of like as an after school alternative. So in that experience, I actually had clients, we had the actual work, we had to talk to them, and revisions are dicey. You should normally start any kind of conversation, and I don't know if this holds true for like larger projects, but in this smaller project, we have so many limitations. I have to tell them when we get in there, and I was nervous to do so because I had been relatively new to the team before when we started it. By the middle, I honestly didn't care. I was starting to just say things because no one was firing me. Where they were just saying like, "Oh, we want this and we want that," and it's like, those are great ideas. I would like to suggest, and then you just give them like a middle of the road answer or an entirely different one, because people kind of just want to hear that they're being heard.
Sure.
So it's not a specific brand sponsorship issue where their representation is extremely important to them, and it's more like they just want to have an idea presented.
They want to feel part of the process.
Yes, it sounded placating when I thought of it like that, but absolutely, that's kind of exactly.
I say this all the time, where like, I'm convinced that a lot of clients make revisions, even if they like it, so that they can feel like they have a level of control and they're part of the process.
It's like an agency.
It's a psychological thing.
Yeah, it's like a psychological dependence on having that agency or that control. So they go for it. Some people, they're a lot better at articulating these desires than others. I did work in a group, so this is like sort of relevant. I did work in the group with them, and we had there were two male identifying people that were there, and then there was one female identifying person there, and she really wasn't there for like most of the group. So I kind of wondered like how much of her opinions were actually being like input into the project. And then we had one male identifying member that was telling us what they would like to see, and he used like terminology I wasn't exactly familiar with. calling the hair of one of our characters a crown. So I had a moment where I thought, did you want us to put an actual like crown on this person's head? So I had to stop the conversation because people were acting like it was normal. But even if it was a usual like colloquialism, like I wasn't familiar. So if I wasn't familiar, I had one of two options. Either never ask that question in front of the client and then ask one of my coworkers to figure out what it was, or just get it directly from the client. And it seemed as though there wasn't a lot of other discussion happening at the time. So I took my shot and I just said, hey, yeah, you mentioned having the character reveal their crown. Is that a term for something? I'm picturing a royal crown on their head. Like, oh, crown. Yes, like a literal golden crown. And he's like, no, like revealing her hair, you know, and revealing her tresses. And I was like, okay, these are a lot of great terms, actually, like tresses, crown. I'm learning a lot. And he kind of gestured to one of my coworkers who was on the Zoom call and said, yeah.
Was he an
like
older man? Because crown is like,
yeah, so he was an older guy.
Jack and Jill fell down the hill and broke their crown. Crown is just,
that's it.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
That's definitely like an older term for it. Like,
got it. So
that would be something like I think my dad would say. And my dad
so he was about dad age, you know, he was like an older gentleman. So I didn't want to like call out anything else. I was just unclear. And then he gestured to one of my coworkers, like, oh, hair like hers. And then I looked at my coworker. My coworker is of a darker complexion than I am. However, we are both African American. So it was funny that he gestured to her and she looked at me and the screen. And then I looked at her and I was like, well, her hair's permed, so it's straight. So do you mean like my hair? And I just kind of like gestured to my hair, which is kind of like this still, like it was just slightly longer. I was like this, like you wanted to like reveal that she has like a large curly hair or like an afro or something. And he's like, yeah. And it was just the funniest thing to talk about afterwards because my coworker and I, we're still really good friends now. And it's like, yo, what was that about? And she's like, he did not anticipate that I would have had hair that wasn't stereotypical to me. So yeah, you may have conversations like that where it's like it just kind of like a light goof between the translation of like either a generational difference or a cultural difference. And it was probably the highlight of the meeting because that was the only suggestion that guy had. And once we like heard him out, he was basically supporting us changing anything else in the project, such as shortening things. Like we played it up to him and he shortened the project. We got a smaller venue, like there were less sets to design thanks to that discussion. So yeah, that kind of comes down to, in a very roundabout way, making that interpersonal connection or that human connection with your client is sometimes a lot easier in a smaller project. And it gives you a lot more leeway because then they see you as a person rather than just a machine that's going to do this animation.
Do the artistic thing.
Yeah, it's like, oh, do the art. Come on, do the art. And just start but yeah, larger projects, no. And that's usually why you'll have
with the projects you've had, have you ever had a cutoff point? So I talked to Mike Parker of Lowbrow Studios. He does a lot of like so he has, I remember in our conversation, you know, his are about 8-week periods roughly. And he has a certain point, I forget exactly, probably week 6, I would assume, or week 5, where he basically goes like, this is it. We are not changing it. Do you ever have that with your clients? Like, you know, sort of a cutoff is like, there are no more changes beyond this point.
So I feel like that'll vary between the studio. The studio he works for, it's a bit more prolific. So they would probably have a lot more of that bargaining power. In terms of our studio where I'm working, which I have to say, like, they're extremely nice. And by saying extremely nice, what I mean is that my management has a softer touch and I despise it. When it comes to like actual project work, I despise it. I don't want you to be my friend. I don't want this to be a discussion. I want it to be told like, hey, they're not going to be able to make any revisions after a certain point in time. So we technically do have a cutoff, which is supposed to be halfway into the project. That's supposed to be done. So whatever length the project is, halfway into the project is when it's supposed to stop. I disagreed.
Okay.
I said that it should be from the start of the project to about 2 weeks in or 3 weeks in, because 3 weeks is about as long as it takes for you to fully regret your decisions. And that's about enough. Like, I don't think it should be anything longer than that. Even that seems a bit too long when I think about it in terms of like a commercial that you would be making. But yeah, you need to have the cutoff. You need to be able to kind of stand firm and say that we can't make any more changes, because at that point you're just going to sacrifice the work. Like, we don't want to do crunch, because crunch is, when you're staying after work or after hours or you're getting overtime. Like, me being paid for overtime does not ameliorate the fact that I'm spending more time on this than I am on my day-to-day duties, on my requirements that are weekly, instead of just this project that's going to be due at the end of 2 months.
Right.
So yeah, it became a thing that I would discuss honestly with like HR and like say like, yeah, we really can't do this anymore, or we can't allow this many changes. It became very frustrating, but we made it out of there. We refer to it as the summer of hell, but it was it was fun.
So I know you do a lot of character design. I know you both do two-dimensional. I've seen your Instagram where it's a lot. I'm assuming those are just sketches and not meant to be turned into 3D models.
Yeah, those are just some 2D sketches. Some of them do become 3D models, but I have a list of characters that has been vivified in the 3D space. And I should probably add them to my website. You've caught me at quite an in-between period since I've been so secure at 2 jobs that I haven't updated my website. Yeah, with my new character designs. But they're coming. I think I should have them by the end of this month.
But speaking of character designs, my students are like just kind of starting out with it. Some of them may have some backgrounds, and community college, sometimes people come in with certain skills and sometimes they don't. Do you have any like tips or advice for people for character design? Whether
Absolutely.
2D or 3D, you can do either or both if you want.
In terms of 3D, at least, if you would like to be seen and kind of like showcase like your styling and work, use other people's work. And this sounded spooky, but don't worry, I'm going to talk you through it. If you like an artist and you really enjoy their work, or if it's even like a smaller artist, even if they're a large artist, like try and like message them or reach out and say, can I use your art piece as a concept work for a 3D model? Like that became a pretty popular thing. I have a friend that he wants to be in Blizzard. So currently he's working with an indie studio. I don't know the name of the studio. There's so many places to work. But he makes 3D models and he kind of tries to keep them on Blizzard model. Like he tries to make them as close as possible to the Blizzard requirements, which have to do with a certain poly count, which is, how many little squares there are inside the character, as well as their design and color. So he likes to ask other artists online, hey, could I do a collaboration? Your artwork, I'm really inspired by it. Would it be possible if I could make a 3D model of it? I have another friend that does the same thing, but she's more into like witchy stuff, Monster High, other witch related things. I'm fantasy related, young adult related stuff. So it's like not Harry Potter, was it like Hunger Games-esque things? I'm very out of that loop. I'm firmly in like the JRPG, like Final Fantasy section of life. So, we don't clash a lot, but when we do collab, it's pretty cute. So yeah, so it's basically like using other people's artwork, and that shows that you have a collaboration or a collaborative spirit, which is really attractive to game studios, or to, honestly, I'm not really sure if like an advertisement studio would be as interested, but I know specifically for game studios, it has to do with you taking somebody else's concepts and making them reality. That's just,
well, I mean, that's that's literally your job, right?
Exactly.
Hey, we need a character for this game. Let's sketch it out. Okay, here's some, concept or orthographic sketches. Now let's model it,
Exactly, because there's like 2 phases to this. There's being the concept artist, the individual that comes up with the character, which, by the way, I recommend taking a look at like character sheets or character reference sheets for released projects. Sometimes they release art books. Those are a really great place to study the material. I have a few art books of my own, though they're like far up and over there. And a few over here from like Marvel Studios. I have a few from the Square Enix, which is the company that makes Final Fantasy, and Nier. I may have lost my Nier book. I probably brought it downstairs because I was sketching. But yes, so looking at how they officially laid out character concept sheets would probably give you a hint as to how you should display your characters if you want to turn them into 3D or if you want to turn them into a 2D animated character. It's giving as much information as possible to the other artist, even if that other artist is you. Like you can be the artist that does the 2D concepting and the 3D work, because that's kind of what I do. It's just really fun. Being able to work on your own piece and see it in 2 different versions is awesome. But that being said, if you want to focus on 2D art, I still would recommend probably taking sometimes people say don't use fan art in your portfolio, and I kind of disagree. I don't think you should put fan art in your portfolio that directly mimics the art itself. That kind of just shows that you're very good at interpreting information that's already there. But taking a character and perhaps adding them to another design, such as taking Mega Man and turning them into a Dark Souls character, or taking Pokemon and turning them into Jurassic Park creations, like these kind of combinations can be very valuable just because it shows either a hiring artist or the concept artist on another team, like, hey, this person has the chops to like mix this different pieces of media together and give us a more convincing design. So that's a lot of like, I may have gone off topic, but for the most part, it's 2D design, keep drawing always. And for 3D design, use your own works if you can, but where you can't, try and collaborate. Those collaborations are going to serve you pretty well as you go forward.
That's good advice. I hadn't thought about that before, but yeah. I think with one final question, where, you know, I usually people I would talk to are purely animators, so this might, you can go into game area too if you want.
Sure.
But where would you like to see animation go in the future? Or where do you think the future of animation is?
Oh boy, that's an interesting question. I think for the most part, I would probably tell people like stop being realism. It seems it seems like a weird thing.
I've had this like fight for years. I've had this fight since literally. I'm gonna tell you a story. Okay, so when I was in college, I was in a 3D animation class, and we had to choose like, you know, an animation to do.
Yeah.
And so everyone comes up with stories and some storyboards, and someone's like, I'm gonna make a realistic tree, and then there's gonna be like leaves that fall and blah blah blah. And I just kind of went, well, why don't you just get a film camera and film that? Like, why does it, not to be mean, but it's like, yes, you can, you know, it's cool to make something look realistic, but like we have a device for that. It's called a video camera.
Yeah, for the most part, I see it as in two different camps, which is people who think that realism is a style and people who think that realism is like a goal. Okay, so like this is like the kind of, and I think I could kind of explain it if I don't get like completely off track. But people who think that realism is a goal where it's the be all end all of 3D, like this is going to become our Skynet, this is going to become our cyberspace.
It's gonna become
I don't really see
reality.
Yeah, like people like that, like I see that as being like Avatar 2. Like it's a movie that's really pretty, but it's more of just a nature documentary on an alien planet. Like this it's in its own way, that would be a really cool concept. And I think that that's a better concept than what the movie presented, because it just kind of fell, for me, it fell flat emotionally. Like it doesn't feel like an emotional film to me, because I was more interested in seeing the alien life forms that were just living in an ecosystem. That's realism as a goal, just having another completely realistic space, but it's not real. Like it's great. And then there's people who see realism as a style. Like I think that stylistically speaking, realism wears out its welcome a lot faster than someone that like a project that has better art design. So that's a project, like I think the biggest thing that happened online, like the discussion between like video games, AAA video games and like non ones, where there's this game called Hi-Fi Rush and there's a video game called Forspoken. So the video game called Forspoken is a pretty realistic game. It's about a girl in a fantasy universe that gets cool fantasy powers, but it kind of falls flat because there's no strong art direction inside of the game. When I went into the game, it felt gray, it didn't feel lived in, but not in the way that, I don't know, a movie like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre felt horrifying. You know, it's a place where the color is this burnt out orange and these browns, and things feel dirty and they feel lived in, and you feel like life has passed here. Forspoken didn't feel like that to me. I didn't see the life that once was. I just saw something that was a 3D space populated with kind of just other 3D objects. Like it never felt more like a tech demo to me than that game. And then there's Hi-Fi Rush.
I understand what you're saying. It's a difference between a realistic painting and a stylistic painting, like say Matisse or Picasso.
Exactly. Like an impressionist.
It's not meant to be reality. It's meant to be a version of reality that they choose.
Yeah. It feels flatter when it's kind of made realistic because you think that stylistically that's the better idea versus strongly art directed pieces such as like the new Resident Evil comes to mind. Basically, it's like a game where things are realistic, but the color has been warped, or something's been changed to kind of make it seem as though you're trying to lead me somewhere. I need that human eye element to it. At that point, an AI could have made Forspoken, and I would have believed it. Sure. But a game that has a strong identity, I guess. Once you add realism, the identity kind of just becomes, this looks pretty realistic.
Sure. Like, I think for me, I think it has to do with the medium. Like, when I was talking about the realism, I was talking about an animation versus an interactive world like a game. I think for me, and I don't know if it's because of my generation, I grew up watching Bugs Bunny cartoons where things are very animated. Like they're not meant to be reality, they extend reality, right? The proportions are all off and the way that they move is extremely exaggerated. And for me, animation, that for me personally, that is like what I like about it. I want things to extend reality, not mimic reality. Like even like something in Pixar where the one a couple of years ago, Soul, right? It's like the characters are meant to look like human, like they're not like purple or whatever, but they still have their proportions are different and they kind of mimic. They don't try to mimic reality. And I think that's
they're still exaggerating.
What makes animation interesting, but that's me. And maybe it's a generational thing. So like for me, like I can understand why in a simulation or a game, you would want more realism because then it becomes a quote unquote reality as opposed to a passive, experience of watching something.
But I think like, I guess for me, that would be in faces most of all. That's where I tend to notice it the most. Faces that are directly motion captured tend to be kind of weird and like unnerving versus faces that are just kind of hand animated, because I know that this isn't like, this character is a 3D character that's acting for me versus like a character that's acting through a human is acting as them. And honestly, I think it's something as simple as sightlines, because when a character is being facial motion captured, like their eyes are kind of like, they're focused, but they're kind of darting around a face. Like they have the normal eye ticks a human would have. If it's an animated character, they're kind of looking straight around or around the shoulder point of a camera. And it stays steady there. Like I know no human head is going to be like, whoop, sideways, and that's where they're looking at me. Sure. I know they're just acting. I think if we could just meld that version of facial motion capture with very obvious character acting that kind of keeps them separate from me, I think that'd probably be a really good spin for it, like a Hugh-framed Roger Rabbit but in 3D scenario. Like it's possible. I think it's very much, it's really just like timelines. Like a lot of people are having a big issue when it comes to like finishing projects on time, because a lot of these projects just get super big really fast. And there's just, look, man, if you can get all the animation from a motion capture artist, God bless you. God bless you, because motion capture is so finicky, and being a motion artist, even on just one project, I was exhausted because there's so much you have to take out of the animation just to make it palatable and like watchable, because humans move so much faster than 3D.
Well, it's kind of funny, just I interviewed Arnie Wong, who worked on Heavy Metal, like the one from the 80s, early 80s. So anyway, they did a lot of rotoscoping in that one. Nice. And he was saying that even though it's like literally what the character was doing, that when they played it back, it didn't look natural at all. And so they actually ended up animating on top of the rotoscoping to make it more palatable, like you said. So I think it's kind of interesting where it's like, you think capturing all of the all of the data, so to speak, of like where things are positioned are going to make it more realistic, but they end up looking more uncanny.
Uncanny Valley is still, I think it's still one heck of a Marianas Trench that we're trying to get around, because we're not really, humans see and perceive in a way that isn't just math. It's not just 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second. It's not just the blinks. There's something else. I'm not sure what it is, and I feel like now I'm just philosophizing at this point. But every time I like think about game animation or trying to make something more realistic, and then what I've done with motion capture work to try and figure out like how much of this can we take and put in the character, there's something in my brain that tells me if something is not real. And then
Sure.
if it gets triggered, it's hard for me to look away. Like I
Right.
can't really figure it out. But if that doesn't get triggered and then I find out later that it hasn't been real that whole time, like something that's more like an AI approximation of it, I somehow feel even more betrayed. Like an artist probably could have made me convinced. I don't know. It's definitely gonna be an interesting question as the years go by and we get faster and faster cameras or just better processing power on my computer, honestly, because I can on a personal PC, rendering out something that's 60 frames per second is about the height of what I can do. Because even if it's my gaming PC, it's just a lot. It's a lot of frames. It's a lot to do.
Right.
And getting stronger in that or getting better processing power, that might change the game in terms of what we're going to consider, palatable motion capture. So yeah, I'll just wait for that. Until then, I still got to get a PS5 because boy, those are expensive. But yeah, I mean, the technology, it'll advance. It'll become more accessible.
All right, interesting. So where can my students see any of your work or see your find you online if you're okay with that?
Sure thing. I think one of the places that you can check out if you'd like to see like smaller works are Animation Project themselves. So the Animation Project.
I'll put that in this is going to be online, so I'll have a link to it.
Awesome. So the Animation Project, I can kind of put their name in there just in case so that you can see them. And then what's the other thing? My own personal works. Well, you found me through my Instagram, which I honestly think is becoming more of a dream journal than anything because I've been seeing a lot of strange stuff and I'm just drawing it now. Let me see. I do have a Vimeo, but it's very underproduced.
Populated with work.
Yeah, word.
We have a Wix, but I don't think there was any actual animation on it. I think it was just like, seeing the projects you worked on.
Let me see. My Wix has some animation on like the second page probably, but not my own page. Let me see. Logging in, not logging in. Interesting. Yeah, I think that's about it. Yeah, either my Wix and I do have a YouTube. Let me see. That's also more process work, to be fair. A lot of my
might be interested in that, to be honest. Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of stuff where you get to see the final, but not, sometimes I think especially for students, I think it's nice to see like, you and I are probably somewhere where it's like the Square Enix books, right? Or like looking at like the concept art or like a Pixar movie. It's like, it's kind of interesting to see sort of behind the scenes of like what the process really is.
I do have my full thesis on there, which I think I'm going to probably reanimate at some point just because it's a lot easier to picture that being new. Yeah, cool. I think that's about everything. I'll have to find my Vimeo again. It's just.
I'll post that for my students. So.
Sure thing. Let me see. Oh, I found it. I found me. I have 2 total videos on Vimeo. That sounds great. Share me. There we go. And then Vimeo. Vimeo is probably a better option, to be fair, because it's a lot more streamlined versus YouTube. YouTube has been very distracting lately, not great. But yeah, so this is probably where I have more recent work from Pratt. One of them is an animation I did with my students for Pratt, and then the other one is my previous thesis. You get 2 and then you finish out your schooling.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
fine. That's everything.
Well, we appreciate your time. Awesome. Thank you, Gabrielle. Appreciate it.